The waves crashed gently against the shore below the sprawling, glass-walled mansion, sunlight spilling across the marble floors as if trying to soften the chaos within. But nothing could quiet the hurricane that lived inside these walls, a hurricane with three small faces, sharp minds, and a limitless appetite for mischief. Damien Ross, one of Miami's most visible tech billionaires and one of its few openly gay single fathers, had learned to run multi-billion-dollar mergers while dodging drone helicopters, buzzing through his hallways and furniture, mysteriously taped to the ceiling. It had been this way ever since his partner died in a sudden accident, leaving him to raise the triplets alone. Leo, Max, and Finn, children he had taken in as infants under circumstances he never fully understood, because his late partner had handled every adoption paper, every signature, every call. At first, Damien believed the challenge of parenting would be finding time between boardrooms and bedtime stories. But the real challenge was keeping anyone willing to stay and help. 10 nannies had already walked out in just 2 months. One fled in the dead of night after finding the smart home system hacked to blast heavy metal at 3 in the morning. Another quit when she discovered her purse glued shut and every spoon in the house taped to the kitchen ceiling. There was even the time the triplets launched a drone into a guest room and live-streamed the startled screams of a nanny to Damien's office. Each time, Damien was left with 3 grinning boys who looked more like cherubs than the masterminds they were. And still, he couldn't be angry for long. The boys had survived loss before they could even form memories. And he had promised his partner that no matter what, he would give them a life where they never felt abandoned again. But promises are heavy things to carry when you're balancing shareholders and science projects. By the second month without stable help, Damien found himself scanning agency rosters like a man drowning looks for driftwood. The agency sent polished candidates with glowing resumes, people who lasted exactly long enough to discover that intelligence and chaos lived side by side in the Ross household. The triplets weren't mean. They weren't cruel. They were testing the world, searching for boundaries, for someone who could meet them eye to eye instead of looking down with fear or frustration. Damien knew it, but knowing didn't make his life easier. That morning, as he stood on the balcony, coffee in hand, watching 3 small figures chase each other through the backyard in a whirl of energy, he wondered if this was simply how it would be, a revolving door of strangers, no one lasting long enough for the boys to feel safe. He didn't know that by the end of the day, a stranger would step through his gates who was not on any roster, not on any list, a man who would not only tame the storms, but unlock a secret Damien had unknowingly been living with for 7 years. Sometimes the right people arrive without fanfare, without warning, in the middle of your exhaustion. And sometimes they're the first step toward a truth you've been both fearing and needing to face. If stories like this make your heart beat a little faster, follow Heart's story so you never miss what happens next. Because what walked into Damien's life that afternoon would change not just the boy's future, but the very meaning of family in ways none of them could have imagined. In the end, it is not perfection that holds a home together. It is the stubborn decision to stay, even in the mess, even when the storms are loud, because love is not afraid of chaos. The security gates had barely finished their slow mechanical sweep when a tall figure stepped through, carrying nothing but a backpack and the confidence of someone who had already decided this was where he belonged. His name was Ethan Ward, 29 years old, a former high school sports coach whose resume looked more like a yearbook than a corporate portfolio. He wasn't dressed like any candidate Damien had met before. No pressed uniform, no polished smile rehearsed for an interview, just a plain shirt, sun-worn jeans, and a posture that spoke of patience rather than performance. When the housekeeper hesitated at the threshold, Ethan simply said he'd heard about Damien's trouble keeping a nanny and figured he'd try his luck. No agency had sent him. No formal application preceded his arrival. In fact, his introduction was disarmingly short. "I know kids act out when they feel no one is listening. I can listen." Damien, used to structured vetting and background checks, considered sending him away immediately. But the morning had been brutal. Leo had nearly rewired the espresso machine. Finn was attempting to turn the koi pond into a water obstacle course. and Max had set off a cascade of dominoes across the living room that knocked over a lamp worth more than some people's cars. Against his better judgment, Damien agreed to let Ethan try for the day. What happened next felt like the first breath after weeks underwater. By midday, the shrieks from the backyard weren't the usual war cries of chaos, but the sound of focused teamwork. Ethan had corralled the boys into building a floating bridge of pool floats, challenging them to get across without touching the water. The rules were simple, the stakes were bragging rights, and the triplets, for once, were too absorbed to cause collateral damage. When the game ended, Ethan didn't order them to clean up. He turned it into a race, each boy stacking and storing the floats faster than the others. From the upstairs office window, Damien watched, expecting the inevitable loss of control, but Ethan never raised his voice. He matched their energy, redirecting it instead of crushing it. At lunch, they ate without a single argument, each boy recounting his best move from the game, while Ethan listened as though they were athletes recounting a championship. That evening, Damien found himself studying the man more closely. Ethan asked no questions about the size of the house, the luxury cars in the garage, or the framed Forbes covers on the walls. He spoke to the children with the same respect he gave Damien, never indulging bad behavior, but never humiliating them either. When Damien offered to discuss salary, Ethan shook his head. If this works out, we'll talk. For now, I'm here because of them, not the paycheck. It had been a long time since Damien had met someone who treated his sons as more than an accessory to his wealth. Something in Ethan's quiet conviction unsettled him in a good way. By nightfall, the triplets were sprawled on the living room rug, building towers out of blocks, too tired to scheme. The house was peaceful in a way Damien had forgotten was possible. It wasn't that the boys had changed in a single day, but the way they were seen had. And that was the first lesson Ethan brought into the Ross household, that sometimes discipline is not the absence of kindness, and listening is not weakness. In the hands of the right person, boundaries become bridges, and a child's defiance is simply another form of hope that someone will finally see them for who they are. Within weeks, the sharp edges of the Ross household began to soften. The triplets still carried their boundless energy, but it no longer erupted without direction. Ethan had introduced something he called the 5-minute rule. Whenever a prank, a mess, or a misstep occurred, the boys had exactly 5 minutes to explain in what they had been trying to achieve and then turn it into something constructive. At first, Leo tried to outwit the rule with long-winded justifications. Max turned it into a performance, and Finn attempted to negotiate his way out of it entirely. But over time, those minutes became moments of reflection, where mischief revealed curiosity and trouble became a chance to learn. Damien watched this transformation with a quiet awe. His home no longer felt like a constant battlefield. Meals were calmer. Evenings were not defined by arguments or slammed doors, but by shared activities, a puzzle completed together, a makeshift science experiment that left the kitchen dusted in flour, or a quiet movie night where all 3 boys somehow found a way to share the same blanket. The change extended beyond the children. Damien and Ethan began to share their own stories in the quiet moments after the boys were asleep. Damien spoke about the years before the adoption, how he had trusted his partner so completely that he never questioned the details of the process. He remembered signing papers without reading the fine print, believing love was enough to justify trust. Now, with his partner gone, he was left with fragments of a past that didn't entirely make sense. It was during one of these late conversations that Damien mentioned something odd. A contact from an old law firm had reached out, suggesting there might be irregularities in the adoption records. The words were heavy in the air, carrying the weight of both suspicion and fear. Damien didn't elaborate further, but Ethan noticed how his gaze lingered on the family photos, as though searching for a truth hidden in plain sight. Through it all, Ethan remained a steady presence. When Damien's company hit a difficult quarter, and he quietly delayed staff payments to protect his team, Ethan refused to take his own pay. "I'm here for them," he said simply. And it wasn't a line meant to impress. He meant it. That kind of loyalty was rare in Damien's world. a world where most relationships were measured in profit and loss. The triplets began to treat Ethan as more than a caretaker. He became a co-conspirator in their games, a referee in their competitions, and an anchor when tempers flared. They no longer tested him with pranks designed to drive him away. Instead, they sought his approval, not out of fear, but because they valued it. Damien realized he had stumbled upon something deeper than a solution to his staffing problem. Ethan's methods weren't about suppressing the boys' energy, but about channeling it, teaching them that they were not defined by the trouble they caused, but by the choices they made after. The lesson was subtle yet powerful. Structure was not a cage, but a framework for freedom. And real trust, was not given all at once, but earned in the quiet consistency of someone who shows up, stays, and listens, even when the storm is loudest. By the time spring settled over Miami, Damien had made a decision that felt both practical and deeply personal. Ethan was no longer just the man who had steadied the household. He had become essential to it. The triplets trusted him without hesitation, and Damien knew that if anything were to happen while he was away on business, there was no one else he would rather have holding the line. The answer was obvious: Ethan needed legal authority, not just informal trust. Damien began arranging the paperwork to name him as the household's chief caretaker and official guardian of the boys whenever Damien was absent. The evening he planned to tell him, the house was quiet. The triplets had been tucked in after an afternoon of beach soccer, their laughter still lingering in the air. Damien had set the table on the terrace, the ocean breeze carrying the faint scent of jasmine. This wasn't a proposal in the romantic sense, though Damien could not deny that his feelings for Ethan had grown into something far more complex than gratitude. It was about recognition, giving a man who had given so much the protection of the law and the acknowledgement he deserved. But before he could speak, the sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. A sleek black sedan rolled through the gates, stopping in front of the mansion. From it emerged a man Damien had never seen before, mid-30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his presence sharp and deliberate. He introduced himself with a name Damien didn't recognize, but his next words cut through the evening air. He claimed to be a biological relative of Leo, Max, and Finn, and without asking permission, he opened a leather folder and produced original birth certificates, each bearing the boys' names and his signature as father. Damien's first instinct was to shield the boys from whatever this was, but before he could respond, the man's gaze shifted and landed squarely on Ethan. His expression shifted from polite formality to something more personal, almost startled. "Ethan," he said, as though confirming the impossible. Ethan froze, his usual composure stripped away in an instant. In that heavy silence, the stranger revealed a truth Damien could not have anticipated. He was Ethan's cousin, a man Ethan had lost contact with years ago. He spoke of a time in the hospital when he had been coerced into signing away his parental rights, told it was for the safety of his newborn nephews after a family tragedy. He had believed them taken into legitimate care, not whisked into a private adoption orchestrated without his consent. Damien's mind reeled, the words irregularities in the adoption records flashing back like a warning unheeded. And then came the detail that shifted the ground beneath them. All the man claimed that adoption had been part of a larger operation involving falsified documents, where infants were placed into new homes under the guise of legality. But with no true consent from the families they had been taken from, the triplets slept on, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering outside their bedroom door. Damien stood between the man and the staircase, unsure whether to protect his family or demand more answers. Ethan, still processing, met Damien's eyes with a look that carried both shock and a dawning sense of responsibility. This was not just Damien's past being called into question, it was his as well. The moment underscored an unshakable truth: the people who raise us and the people we are connected to by blood are not always the same. But when those two worlds collide, it is character, not circumstance, that determines who will stand firm when the truth threatens to undo everything. The days that followed blurred into a sequence of phone calls, legal consultations, and quiet, tense conversations after the triplets had gone to bed. Damien had always believed the adoption was clean, if unconventional. He trusted his late partner's judgment, never imagining the possibility of deception. But the investigation that unfolded stripped away that belief piece by piece. The original hospital records were unearthed, revealing that Leo, Max, and Finn had been born to Ethan's sister, a woman who, along with her husband, had vanished under mysterious circumstances 7 years earlier. In the confusion that followed, a corrupt hospital employee had forged consent forms, transferring the infants into the hands of Damien's partner. The revelations were sickening in their precision. The network behind it, a small but sophisticated child trafficking ring, had already been dismantled, but its echoes lived on in the altered paperwork that had given Damien legal custody. He realized now that his late partner's role was not entirely innocent. Whether motivated by desperation or something darker, he had helped conceal the truth, ensuring the boys would never be traced back to their birth family. For Ethan, well, the truth was a double-edged sword. The boys he had grown to love as his charges were, in fact, his nephews, the only living link to the sister he had lost. He grieved for the years stolen from them, but he also recognized what Damien had given them: stability, opportunity, and a kind of love that had kept them whole in the absence of their parents. Legally, the discovery might have been grounds for an upheaval, but the courts, taking into account the destruction of the trafficking network and the fact that both Damien and Ethan now held legitimate guardianship, chose to affirm their joint custody. They were no longer just employer and employee, they were, by law and by choice, the two men responsible for raising these three boys. When the decision came, Damien and Ethan didn't celebrate with champagne or grand gestures. Instead, they took the triplets to the beach for a picnic. The boys chased each other across the sand, their laughter echoing in the salt-tinged air. As the sun sank lower, casting gold across the waves, Leo paused beside Damien and looked up with weak, searching eyes. "So, I know, are we yours or his?" he asked, nodding toward Ethan. Damien glanced at Ethan, who met his gaze without hesitation. "You're ours," Damien said softly. "Family doesn't have to start the way you expect. Sometimes it begins in the middle of a storm, but it lasts because we choose to stay in it together." The boys didn't need more explanation. They raced back to the shoreline, shouting for the two men to join them in building a fortress from driftwood. As they worked side by side in the fading light, Damien understood the lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Love is not diminished by the truth. Even when that truth is hard to face, it grows stronger when it chooses honesty over comfort, commitment over convenience. And sometimes, the family you end up with is even more unshakable than the one you were born into. What about you? Do you believe family is defined by blood, or by the people who stay when it matters most? Follow Heart Stories to hear more stories that will make you feel, think, and remember what truly holds us together: